Picture this. You've had a pistol brace on your AR pistol for years, terrified every single day that the ATF was going to knock on your door and call it an illegal short-barreled rifle. Or maybe you're a small-time seller who sold a handful of guns out of your personal collection over the years, always wondering if one bad day could get you labeled an unlicensed dealer and facing federal charges. What if I told you the rules around both of those situations just changed in a single afternoon in the biggest rollback of federal gun regulation in more than a decade? What actually shifted? Does this mean your brace is finally officially safe? And if you're a dealer, does this change what engaged in the business even means for you going forward? Before we dig into all of that, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because federal gun law is moving fast right now, and this channel breaks down exactly what these changes mean for regular gun owners, not just lawyers and lobbyists. So let's set the scene. On April 29th, 2026, the Department of Justice and the ATF dropped 34 notices of final and proposed rulemaking in a single release. This wasn't a minor tweak or a quiet clarification buried in the Federal Register. This was the result of a 14-month review of essentially every firearms regulation put in place during the previous administration. And it landed the same afternoon the Senate confirmed Robert Cicada as the new ATF director on a narrow 54-46 vote. The timing wasn't an accident. This was a coordinated, deliberate statement from the DOJ that the regulatory landscape for gun owners and dealers was about to look very different. And it was done under the authority of Executive Order 14,206, which is literally titled Protecting Second Amendment Rights. Let's talk about the piece that's probably been on your mind if you own an AR-style pistol, the brace rule. For years, the 2023 pistol brace rule created a legal minefield. Under that rule, a huge number of braced pistols were reclassified as short-barreled rifles, which meant owners suddenly needed to register them under the National Firearms Act or risk felony charges, carrying up to 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. That rule got hammered in federal court with rulings like Mock versus Bondi in the Fifth Circuit and Johnson versus ATF in the Eighth Circuit, essentially gutting its enforceability. And the DOJ eventually dropped its appeals entirely back in July of 2025. The April 2026 package formally finishes that job. It rescinds the 2023 brace rule outright, meaning braced pistols are now classified simply as pistols at the federal level with no NFA registration requirement tied to the brace itself. That's a massive relief for millions of owners who've been living with legal uncertainty over a piece of equipment they bought in good faith. But here's a question worth asking, and it's one people keep getting wrong online. Does this mean your braced pistol is bulletproof, legally speaking, in every single state? No. This is a federal reclassification, and federal law only sets the floor, not the ceiling. States like California, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and Washington can still restrict or ban braced pistols under their own state laws, regardless of what the ATF says at the federal level. So if you live in one of those states, the celebration needs an asterisk, and you absolutely need to check your specific state statutes before you assume you're in the clear. Now let's shift to the other half of this title, because the dealer side of this reform is arguably even more consequential for a huge number of everyday gun owners who never considered themselves dealers at all. Under a Biden-era rule, the definition of who counts as engaged in the business of dealing firearms was expanded significantly, sweeping in casual private sellers who might sell a handful of guns from their personal collection over time. That expansion created real anxiety because crossing that line without a federal firearms license is a serious criminal offense. The April 2026 package rescinds that regulatory expansion. Important nuance here, and this is where a lot of headlines get sloppy. The underlying statutory definition from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act itself isn't going anywhere. Congress passed that, and the DOJ can't just erase it through rulemaking. What's being rolled back is the regulatory overreach layered on top of that statute, the broader interpretation that pulled casual sellers into dealer territory. So if you occasionally sell a firearm from your personal collection, this reform is aimed directly at giving you more breathing room, though the core legal line for what makes someone an actual dealer still exists. There's more buried in this package that deserves attention, too. The DOJ is standing up a new federal gun rights restoration system, and it's narrowing the legal definitions used to determine who counts as an unlawful drug user or a fugitive from justice for the purposes of the federal firearm ban. Those two categories have historically been broad and, frankly, kind of vague, catching people in situations that didn't necessarily reflect genuine danger, and narrowing them could restore gun rights to people who lost them under fairly loose interpretations. On a more technical level, dealer-to-dealer transfers are also getting modernized, moving from an old certified paper copy verification system to something called Easy Check, an electronic verification process that's already gone into effect for that specific piece. Here's something the package explicitly does not touch, and I want to be clear about this because misinformation spreads fast in this space. This reform does not eliminate the National Firearms Act. Suppressors, short-barreled rifles, machine guns, and other NFA items still require federal registration, full stop. The elimination of the $200 NFA tax stamp that took effect on January 1st, 2026 was a completely separate change driven by tax legislation, not this regulatory package, so don't confuse the two. And perhaps most notably, this package does not touch the 2023 ATF frame and receiver rule, the so-called ghost gun rule. That regulation remains tied up in ongoing litigation, and this reform package made a clear decision to leave that fight for another day. So what actually happens next? A lot of what was announced on April 29th is proposed, not final, which means it now has to go through a 90-day public comment period before it can become binding law. That means gun owners, dealers, and advocacy groups on every side of this issue have a window to weigh in. And depending on the volume and substance of that feedback, the final rules could shift from what was originally proposed. Some pieces, like the Easy Check verification system, are already in effect right now with no waiting required. Others, like the formal codification of the dealer definition rollback, are still working through that process. If you're a dealer or a brace owner trying to figure out exactly where you stand today versus where things will stand in a few months, that distinction between final and proposed matters enormously, and it's worth tracking closely rather than assuming everything announced that day is already locked in. At the end of the day, this is being called the largest single-day rollback of federal firearms regulation in more than a decade, and whether you see that as overdue relief or a step in a controversial direction, it's reshaping how millions of gun owners and thousands of dealers operate right now. If you own a braced pistol, check your state law before you relax. If you're a casual seller, understand that the statutory line still still exists even as the regulatory overreach gets pulled back. And if you're waiting on the proposed pieces to finalize, that 90-day comment window is where the real action is happening next. Let me know in the comments which part of this affects you most, your brace, your dealer status, or your rights restoration, because I want to know what to dig into deeper in a future video. Subscribe if you found this useful, because federal firearms law is shifting fast this year, and I'll see you in the next one.